Right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on the history of Chapel Allerton. My name's Mark Parry, and I'm going to introduce to you our presenter, who's Steven Burt, who spent most of his childhood in Chapel Allerton, where he developed a passionate interest in the history of the locality. He's Vice President of the Thoresby Society and a trustee of the Paul Thackeray Heritage Foundation. He is former museum director of the Royal Armouries and in 2010 received an honorary doctorate of education from Leeds Beckett University. His lifelong interest in local history was recognised in 2013 when he became visiting professor of history at the University of Huddersfield. With Kevin Grady, he wrote the now classic work, The Illustrated History of Leeds, first published in 1994. He collaborated with Rachel Unsworth to produce Leeds, Cradle of Innovation, published in 2018. And in 2021, he published The Remarkable Story of Hunslet. If you have any questions during this presentation, please use the Q&A facility. Otherwise, it's over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, all. I'm most grateful to Leeds Civic Trust for the opportunity to tell you about the new book Rachel and I are producing on Chapel Allerton. So without delay, let's get on. What does Chapel Allerton refer to? Let us begin by defining the bounds of Chapel Allerton, which are clearly delineated here on the 1839 Baines and Newsom map of Leeds. Chapel Allerton was one of 10 Oates townships of Leeds, which included Headingley-cum-Burley, Potter Newton, Farnley, Bramley, Armley, Wortley, Holbeck, Hunslet and Beeston. When James Wardell wrote his municipal history of the borough in 1836, he stated that the out township of Chapel Allerton covered an area of 2,720 acres, 1 rood and 10 perches. That is 50 acres larger than the in-township Leeds itself. So it's a huge area. So let's have a look at the earliest plan of the area, which Mr. John Tuke produced in 1781. Now, I've put some familiar supermarket names on this map, so you can get some idea of your bearings. What we have here, the W, is Waitrose at Meanwood. The S is Sainsbury's at More Allerton. The T is Tesco on Rounday Road, and the L here is Lidl on Harrogate Road, near Chapel Allerton itself. So just let's get our bearings. Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Lidl. And this vast area is what I'm going to be talking about today. A cursory glance shows that the area is dominated by moors, commons and waste, with areas of farmland carefully carved out in the landscape, and small pockets of surviving wood here at Meanwood and across here at Gledhow and Barker's Wood. Its population in 1781 didn't even reach 1,000 people across that entire area. So this is the area that the subject of the book, not just that around the mustard pot. So now let's look at the evidence that's available to us to help us understand the early history of Chapel Allerton. Like so many places, the Domesday Book gives us the first glimpse. And it states, in Allerton, Glounier had 6 paraquets, land to be taxed, and there may be 3 ploughs there. Now Ilbert, that was a Norman baron called Ilbert de Lacy, has it, and it is waste. Value in King Edward's time, 40 shillings. There is woodland pasture, 1/2 a league long and 1/2 broad. What a load of impenetrable gobbledygook. Yet within that, it contains some really useful information. It confirms that the area was called Allerton, which is Old English for farming the older trees, that a Scandinavian leader or thane called Glunier had it in 1066, and that there were so many people living there that 40 shillings was generated in tax, and that his tenants used 3 ploughs on the arable land. The area was covered by significant parts of woodland. But after the Norman invasion of this area, which had occurred earlier in 1086, which was known as the harrying of the North, the situation had changed radically. William the Conqueror's men had ravaged the area, destroyed houses, removed livestock, until there was not a single person left in the area capable of paying tax. It was waste. So where were these fields located that were left barren in 1086? They were obviously going to be found on a south-facing area which was well drained and where the soil was as rich as possible. But what evidence do we have to help us locate this? It is incredibly fortunate that in 1738, a Leeds schoolmaster called Thomas Wilson became obsessed with the old charters relating to Kirkstall Abbey and decided to find as many as he possibly could. He wrote to all the gentry in the area who had bought former monastic lands, and also members of the clergy, in the hope that they had in their possession such material which had been handed over to them at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries. He struck gold when he received a response from the Reverend Richard Bainbridge, curate of Chapel Allerton, who told him that in the chapel there was an old metal-bound box which contained numerous charters that had once belonged to the monks of Kirkstall. When Wilson went out and opened the chest, there were over 350 documents. 200 were in a poor condition, but 150 were in remarkably good condition and still legible. They contain a mass of detailed information on the development of Chapel Allerton in the period from 1152 to 1540, including at times what land was given to them and where it was located. On the 29th of August, 1738, Wilson wrote to Brown Willis of Wadden Hall in Buckinghamshire, an expert on monasticism, sharing the new information he had gleaned from these documents, including the name of 2 abbots that had never been identified before. Now, what's fantastic for a study in Chapel Allerton is that these still survive today. Some at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, a large number in West Yorkshire Archive in Leeds, and more at the University of Leeds. So by using this material, all the detail in there, the draft enclosure plan of 1812 and the 6-inch to the mile OS map of 1851, it's been possible to recreate what this area looked like in 1150, just before the monks of Kirkstall were granted land here. Now, just for a second, and to help your bearings, here we have Stonegate Road going from Monk Bridge, Waitrose is here, up Stonegate Road across to Shadwell, with King Lane, and we have Lidget Lane. As we look at this, we can see straight away 2 areas of arable land. One here at Allerton. This today is Gledhow Valley Road, so you can see you're heading up towards Moortown, and halfway up to Lidget Lane, that was one tranche of this land with the cottages living there. And here we have the second at Gledhow, opposite Gledhow Hall here. Now, why this is fascinating is that we know that in that period from 1086 to 1150, a man called Simpson Allerton, along with his wife and his family, had moved into the area and encouraged others to do the same. He had built a mill. The site still surviving today as flats, the former tannery site, Belmongery site. And where Meanwood Park is, he cleared the land there and created another piece of arable land. And you can still see these salients, these strips in that parkland to this very day. Now, in 1152, monks came from Barnleswick, where the community of Cistercians had failed to thrive. Henry de Lacy, the Norman overlord of all this area, who was based at Pontefract Castle, encouraged his tenant, William Poitou, to grant the monks land at Kirkslon, on which to build the abbey. But he also made clear that others should follow his example. And amongst the first to grant land was Simpson de Allerton. As soon as the monks received this grant, it did not include all the arable land in those fields. And so they had to create their own base. And so between the two field systems of Allerton and Gledhow, they put a new farm, which was a monastic grange, which today it's still known that area as Allerton Grange. And this was the base of their farming activities. The monks were renowned for the quality of the wool they produced, which was exported mainly to Italy and Flanders. Sheep were grazed over a huge area known as Moortown and Moor Allerton, and the fleeces were sent to the abbey via Stonegate Road and over what became the Monk Bridge. They also kept cattle near the Grange, and it is no surprise that the beck running through the Allerton Grange estate is known as Tanhouse Beck, this water being used to drive a mill that crushed the oak bark to make the tannin for the use in the tanning process. Now, this entire area remained with cattle. This is a wonderful photograph of Allerton Grange in 1955, just before Leeds City Council bought it for the council estate. What we have here, this became run by the Killingbeck family, and this is Allerton Grange, the 16th century house, and you can just see it to the back here of the 18th century pollard residence. This grange proved so successful that the monks opened another grange on this site, which is Chapel Allerton Hall. And this was the second monastic grange of Allerton. Now, today, of course, we call it Chapel Allerton. So when did the chapel first arrive? The earliest reference we have to this is 1240, in which Alan de Grimston granted to the monks land in Potter Newton, which lies on the road which goes to the Chapel of Allerton and the bounds of Steinbeck. Seems likely, therefore, that it was the abbot as the principal landowner, and by then the lord of the manor, who was responsible for the foundation. But the chapel did not have a license, baptize, marry, or bury anyone, and all these ceremonies had to take place at the parish church of St. Peter's. By 1540, the monks had been granted huge tracts of land in Chapel Allerton, and they had had a real impact on the landscape. It was transformed. Here again, Stonegate Road. What do you notice now in this triangle down towards the old Chapel Allerton village? Most of it now is fields. And the same over here. They've cleared a large area for fields, new farms created. They've also constructed the Monk Bridge. Wood mill has been expanded, and you've even got metalworking up here at the far end of Meanwood Woods, straddling each side of Meanwood Beck. But by 1540, the monks are no longer farming this land on their own. Instead, it's all leased out to tenants. On the 22nd of November, 1539, Abbot John Ripley and his 31 members of his community surrendered the abbey to Richard Leighton, King Henry VIII's representative. I've just put these two up so that you can see the contrast and the impact of Cistercianism on that landscape. And I think what is remarkable is, of course, that many of the current housing estates still use these field bounds today. Now, from 1540 to 1700, the farming community here prospered. The former tenant farmers of Kirkstall Abbey, the Killingbecks, who held the two granges of Chapel Allerton Hall and Allerton Grange, the Marshalls of Carr House, today the Judge's Lodgings, and Lower House, today Alderhill Cottages, and the Fladders of what is today the Delziosa Italian Restaurant, and the Franks of Gledhow Hall were all making a fortune out of farming. And their efforts to own the manor bore fruit in 1566 when they secured a license from Elizabeth I for the sale of the manor to them, the Marshall, Fladder, Killingbeck and Killingbeck families, for the princely sum of £1,453, 16 shillings and sixpence. And this was confirmed again in 1601. Now, we knew where the Killingbecks and the Marshalls and the Frank family lived, but we didn't know until recently where the Fladders lived. And this is where they lived. This today is the Delziosa Italian Restaurant, just across the road near the mustard pot and from Albi. This shows Peterborough's wonderful reconstruction of that Fladder house. And you can see here how the two sections fit together. And if you go inside the restaurant, the timber beams are still there. And this was the home of John Fladder, and he had by far the most scandalous will of the period. He was a married man with two children, William and Catherine, by his wife Anne. They must have been livid when his will was read, as John had been having a rip-roaring affair with a local woman called Anne Broadley. He was to ensure that she and his illegitimate son, also called William, were very well taken care of. John must have known that his actions would lead to heartbreak and bitter disagreement. He left his farmhouse here to his wife, providing that she did not remarry. What a cheek! If she did, then it was to go to his daughter. Both were to receive £4, 6 shillings and 8pence, quite a good sum of money, and his son-in-law John Clark a score of ewes. His wife also benefited from a lifetime interest in another plot of land he had on the west side of Leeds, with the rest going to his son William Fladder. Now, up to this point, all seems well, but then comes the twist of the knife. His son had to surrender all this land to his bastard William Broadley half-brother for 21 years. And this must have brought absolute heartbreak to him. He was given £4 by William Broadley, but nevertheless didn't have the chance to farm the land. He was deprived of the means of income. Now, amazingly, we have his wife Anne Fladder's will, and when you read that, you see just how badly she suffered financially. Now, this was a remote area. And when Henry VIII took over and Protestantism became the religion of the land, 3 monks from Kirkstall went to live at Allerton Grange. And this area remained an area of papists. It was isolated and the perfect place to avoid scrutiny by the authorities, and many remained staunch Catholic. The most graphic illustration of the difficulties of the papists at the time of Elizabeth I is the case of Richard Lumby of Chapel Allerton, who, for at least the last 12 years before his death, had attended neither the Protestant Church of St. Peter's nor the local chapel. When he died on the 3rd of December 1584, his family and neighbours brought his body to the parish church to be buried. They were stopped at the churchyard gate by the curate and church wardens, all ardent Protestants who would not allow them access. So his family decided to leave the corpse at the gate and returned home. It remained there for 4 days. Now, if you want to know what happens, please buy the book. as the 17th century progressed, these farmers were making good money out of supplying meat to the growing population of Leeds and could afford to replace their timber-framed houses, like the Fladder property we've just seen, with modern stone-built houses with backstairs roofs. They used stone quarried nearby. Now, this was in marked contrast to their neighbours in Old Woodley, which was much higher and dominated by poor soils, which were not able to support the number of livestock required to generate high income. The Marshall homes, they were again taken from timber frame to stone properties. This shows you Carr House or Upper House. This is now the site of the judge's lodgings. But this house, the Marshall family's lower house, still survives today and is now known as Alder Hill Cottages. But there were other properties, such as Hilltop. To get your bearings, just where I am now, this is the Myrtle Inn public house. And this is as you go down Dunny Hill. And on the door here, it tells you clearly that it was 1630 when this was created. It was there made out of cleared woodland on a south-facing, well-drained site, and no expense was spared on its building. Another was Worley House. The Worley family, like the Marshalls, Fladders and Franks, had been in the area since monastic times. They were not only farmers, but tanners, and were responsible for developing the land that we know today as Meanwood Park. This wonderful photograph from the Oates archive shows the house in the 19th century. And today, you park your car here and you go to the park. What a shame that that was demolished by Mrs. Oates. Now, one event that brought this remote rural out township of Chapel Allerton the attention of King Charles II was treason. For some Presbyterians who had fought tirelessly for the parliamentarian cause during the English Civil War and had enjoyed a long period of religious tolerance, the return of Charles II in 1660 was an unwelcome development. Their concerns proved well-founded, and the subsequent attack on the freedoms of nonconformists and the imposition of odious taxes by his government left them angry and frustrated. Someone who thought this situation intolerable was Captain Thomas Oates, an ardent Republican, who decided to assess the scale of this discontent, and on the 12th of October, 1663, arranged a meeting in Farnley Wood for like-minded people. He hoped that with a good turnout, they could start a rebellion and depose the new king. Unfortunately, less than 50 turned up, and two key members of the party, one Joshua Greathead and a Mr. Smithson, were actually government spies. They'd already told the royalists at York of the date, time and location of the meeting. A regular body of troops and some members of the county militia were waiting to arrest the plotters. Captain Oates tried desperately to disband his men, but his son was captured, taken to York Castle and tortured. They're being questioned at length. The names of the other plotters were revealed, and in the winter, a special assize was held, and 21 people were sentenced to death. Now, among these rebels was Robert Atkins, an oil drawer who lived near the parish church, Henry Watson, a clothier of Woodhouse Ridge, and John Errington, a cloth dresser of Kergate. Where to dispose of these treasonable individuals? Well, the area between a cluster of cottages at Chapel Allerton and a cluster of cottages on Potter Newton Lane was called Chapel Allerton Moor, or Chapeltown Moor. And it meant that if there was a large crowd, there was plenty of area for them to gather in. And so on Tuesday, the 19th of January, 1664, these three men were taken out of the jail in York tied to a sledge, drawn by 2 horses, and then made to walk to their place of execution, which was the Great Ash Tree. Today, this is the site of Chapel Allerton Primary School. It must have been exhausting. The prisoners were accompanied by the under-sheriff, bailiffs, and an impressive group of local dignitaries, including Robert Benson, the clerk of the assizes, Benjamin Wade of Newgrange in Headingley, who was mayor, Marmaduke Cook, the vicar of Leeds, John Sowden, constable of Chapel Allerton, and Matthew Dawson, constable for Potter Newton. Who was going to carry out this disgraceful act? Well, the hangman was a man called Peter Mason of Holbeck. He was a skilled joiner, and he made the gibbet, which was necessary for the task. But he was also a renowned alcoholic and thief. He'd been condemned to death for stealing a white horse from Mr. Thomas Fenton of Hunslet, but a deal had been brokered whereby he would receive a full pardon in return for executing the 3 condemned men. He relished the task and had no qualms about hanging the men first, then cutting open their bodies, removing their hearts and bowels before then quartering them. The crowd were absolutely appalled because between each cut, he put the bloody knife into his mouth and grinned. He then burned the entrails of the men and buried the ash on the moor near the gallows. Mason then cut off their heads, thrust them into a cloth bag, which he took to the prison on Kergate. There he submerged the severed heads in a barrel of water to suck out the blood. The next day, they were spiked on top of the Moot Hall in Briggate. Robert's body was buried in his garden near the parish church, but the remains of the other 2 were dumped outside the wall of Chapel Allerton Chapel. Horrendous. Now, I put this table up because actually it is such a fascinating piece of information. Obviously, everyone required a fire for cooking and warmth, and so a tax on someone's hearth was a simple and easy way to raise money. It was particularly easy for the tax collector. Now, this reminds us just how small the population was at that period. 1672, only 76 households in 2,720 acres. And look how the society was divided. You have 58 with only 1 or 2 hearths, but then look at those at the top of the pile. 1 with 10 hearths, 4 with 8 hearths, and so on. This was a divided society, rich and poor, with few of the middling sort. Now, the Frank family of Gledhow Hall had been farmers in the area for centuries. And then John Thwaites, 1586 to 1671, a successful Leeds cloth merchant, was fortunate enough to inherit this property from his maternal grandfather. When he died at the remarkable age of 85, the estate passed to his grandson, Edward Waddington. Now, during the 17th century, spas and baths became increasingly popular as places of resort, where people could meet socially and benefit from the healing waters. And in 1671, Edward constructed a fine bathhouse in Gledhow Valley, and this still survives today. He located it where an ice-cold stream could be diverted into this plunge pool here. Visitors removed their clothes here in the warm sweat house, opened the door, came down the steps, plunged in the ice-cold waters, I should imagine for a very short time, and then back up the steps and into the room here where the fire was blazing, where they were rubbed down with oil and given a fine massage. This appealed to the local elite, including the 4th Viscount Irwin of Temple Newsham House, who was a regular visitor there, and he used his coach to get there. And on the 5th of July, 1708, Ralph Thoresby, the Leeds historian, also visited the spa to see if the bathing in these waters would help his son Richard, who was suffering from rickets. The elite had noted the beauties of the area, and change was in the air. A new class of people who did not make their money in farming saw the advantage of working in Leeds, but residing in the clean air, peace and tranquility of Chapel Allerton. And so it becomes the merchant's golden age, 1700 to 1800. Now, one of the most important buildings in the area was Allerton Hall, which had been the property eventually of the Hitchingman family. But in 1730, this had been taken down. And in 1755, Josiah Oates and his wife purchased what was left of the house and built a brand new one on the site. Josiah, 1721 to 82, was a very successful Leeds cloth merchant. He not only rebuilt the house, but also created pleasure grounds. There was a large pond with carping, and he even constructed a viewing mound at the end of his garden where his guests could walk to find a better view of his estate and the surrounding countryside. Some idea of the beauty of his home and its perfect location can be gleaned from the diary of the Reverend Joseph Ismay, who visited Chapel Allerton in 1767. He wrote, "Chapel Allerton is 2 miles north of Leeds and pleasantly situate on a skirt or a fine green of waste or moor. There are a long range of good, neat buildings on each side of this common, with a spacious plain carpet ground between. Mr. Oates' house in particular is an elegant box." Now, Rushworth, Peterborough and I have had rare access to this building. Peter has produced this absolutely fabulous reconstruction of the property in 1782. And the mustard pot is here. Just on from the mustard pot, you have this high. The farm also survives as well. And it's there which the Reverend Ismay went to see a new bird called a white turkey, which is very much. Now, the original house is this, but Josiah and his wife so liked it, they built a huge extension onto the side. So when he died in 1782, and it was put up to let in the local newspapers, on the ground floor was a drawing room, a dining room, a parlour, a kitchen, servants' hall, butler's pantry, and a storeroom. Go up a pair of stairs. There's a drawing room, a lodging room, 6 lodging rooms, and rooms in the attic for servants. At the back, there are 2 kitchens with 2 chambers, a coach house, and a stable for 5 horses. Good cellars in the house as well. The garden is well stocked with fruit trees. There is a fish pond, and there is also a viewing mound at the top here. Now, the thing is, his brother George visited, and he too could see the potential of the area. This is George Oates, Josiah's brother, a highly successful cloth merchant based at Queen's Court on Briggate. His premises still survive today with all the workshops. He decided that the area was worth investing in, and he purchased the Carr House estate from a descendant of the Marshall family. This today is the judge's lodgings, and he had a map made of his new estate, and this is the cartouche from it. How wonderful. It's such a beautiful piece of photography. And here is that map, which is currently kept Westbrook Archives in Leeds, showing that he purchased the Carr House farm, Tunning Hall farm, and Woodside farm, just opposite the Myrtle. Others also saw an investment opportunity. Jeremiah Dixon, here top left, had been born in Gledhow in 1726, the only son of John Dixon, a cloth merchant of Leeds. In 1749, Jeremiah had inherited his father's thriving cloth business, but further increased his wealth by diversifying into property and investing heavily in the air and cold navigation. He'd also married well. He married Mary, daughter of John Smeaton, the brilliant civil engineer. Now, like many of his class, Jeremiah was keen to emulate the lifestyle of the aristocracy in the hope that this would improve his standing in the county. He had fulfilled the role of High Sheriff for Yorkshire in 1758, and he lived in this fine house on Ball Lane, designed by John Carr of York, one of the finest architects of the age. You can see here it's right next to Holy Trinity Church. So the foundations of this are now under the Trinity Centre. In the period 1764 to 1767, he garnered together a whole tract of land at Chapel Allerton, and he remodeled Gledhow Hall, again, we believe, using Carr to design and implement the changes. In 1768, work began on improving the grounds, and you can see on the plan to your right-hand side just how well and skillfully it was planted, but also as well the formal garden with its glass houses over here, accessed via a bridge which still survives across the road. What he also did was come to an agreement in 1765 with William Totty of Chapel Allerton Hall, and he purchased the ancient land on the side of the ancient trackway to make a well-serviced wide road to Chapel Allerton. He also, as well, created a very fine access road, this one here, via Gledhow Park Drive. Both these routes making it easily accessible from Leeds to Harrogate, but both of them using this landscape to give visitors this fabulous long tree-lined carriage driveways, which made most of the beauty of the Gledhow Valley. Irrespective of the chosen route, visitors had to undertake a steep ascent, like a scene from Switzerland, pass under bridges. It was just beautiful. It seems that Dixon employed one Thomas White, who had once worked for Capability Brown at Temple Newsham, to help him landscape this area. And the beautiful plantations that hug the valley of sides of Gledhow were almost certainly his creation. Jeremiah was a keen botanist and became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1773, and he was proactive in acquiring rare specimens and introduced the Atherhousley pine into the district, later affectionately known as the Gledhow pine, which it is believed were propagated from cones brought directly from Switzerland. And we can see the mature landscape here in Turner's stunning painting of 1816. Now, another notable residence was Richard Markham Salisbury here at the top. He was also a botanist and went on to become linked to the creation of what became the Royal Horticultural Society. The son of a wealthy Leeds merchant, he had attended Edinburgh University. After an inheritance from a distant relative of his mother, he went on to purchase this Chapel Allerton Hall estate from the Totty family. The house was beautiful and needed little doing to it, but he built massive hothouse and corresponded with the leading botanists of the day, including Joseph Fount, to try and obtain seeds and rare plants. His downfall came on the 1st of December 1796, when he married Caroline, youngest daughter of John Staniforth of Hull. Soon after the birth of their daughter, she returned to her parents heartbroken, claiming that the man was deep in debt. There was also something about his relaxed attitude to morals, and that his sexual behaviour was questionable. So he fled to London to escape his father-in-law, his creditors, and the fallout of the scandal. The property was put on the market. Now, who's going to take advantage of this situation? Well, on the 22nd of August, 1799, Thomas Nicholson, 1765 to 1821, a successful insurance broker and merchant, bought the estate. He was a local lad. He'd been born in Chapel Allerton, and his father was an Anglican clothier called William, of rather modest means. But his mother, Hannah, had been a baker's stock. Now, quite how Thomas Nicholson went on to make such a fortune in London, one has to imagine. But he was keen in 1799 to return to his roots. The Hall made the perfect residence, the ideal place to flaunt his new wealth. He then went on to buy the Roundy Park, half the Roundy Park estate, with one of his friends, Samuel Ellum, and he resided here whilst his new house there, today known as the Mansion, was constructed. Locals must have been in awe of this man. So, what do you do with your leisure time if you're that wealthy? Well, the Bowling Green Inn, today known as the Three Hullets, was a hub of activity in the 18th century for the elite. Ralph Thoresby's the first to mention horse racing in 1682, but it went on to be so lucrative that others began to organise athletics matches on the moor as well. And the nicknames of these athletes were designed to raise people's curiosity. On the 6th of November 1770, it was reported that a match has been made betwixt Fiddling Dan and Fat Boxer, two noted footmen and cloth dressers in the side. A considerable sum has been bet on them as to who could run the 4-mile course the soonest. A huge concourse of persons yesterday went to see the trial, where unfortunately Fat Boxer fell and paid forfeit for it. On the 26th of May 1760, another new pursuit was tried. It was called cricket, and it soon became extremely popular. And on August the 26th of August 1765, a grand cricket match was played between the gentlemen of Sheffield and the gentlemen of Leeds. Sheffield won. Card assemblies ran every Friday throughout the summer season, and gambling remained rife. Another pursuit was archery, and on the 12th of August 1790, the Yorkshire archers held their meeting there, where the councillors of Mexborough came. Shooting started at 4 o'clock, and then it adjourned to the Bowling Green House, where an excellent dinner was served for 40 gentlemen, who spent the remainder of the day in the greatest conviviality. The gold medal was won by William Lees, but John Dixon of Gledhow Hall won a silver medal. The quality of food consumed on such occasions was also worthy of note by local reporters. They took pleasure in informing the public of the extent of the generosity of various members of the local aristocracy, like the treat provided on the 17th of September 1767 by Edwin Lascelles of Harewood House, who gave an elegant turtle feast to the gentlemen of the neighbourhood at the Bowling Green Inn. These activities attracted members of the aristocracy and gentry to the area, which gained the reputation as the Montpellier of York. Well, what else went on here? I put here this poem, which was even written by a man called Mr. McGeorge, about the delights of the area. Throughout the latter half of the Georgian period, the regular army and navy were overstretched, and so the government encouraged the formation of armed groups of volunteers in towns throughout the country. Whenever war was declared with France and there was the threat of invasion by a foreign power, immediate action had to be taken by members of the Leeds elite, who formed a band of volunteers. And from 1756 until 1815, there were various military corps created, and they used Chapel Town Moor as a place to practice their military manoeuvres. Now, this is an unbelievable survivor. This is actually the Leeds volunteers on Heath Common. This is exactly what it would have looked like on Chapel Town Moor. 1782, another local armed force was created for the defence of the realm. And the King signed commissions appointing John Dixon of Gledhow Hall the captain and Thomas Lloyd and Richard Leeds his lieutenants. In July 1784, Captain Dixon married Lydia, daughter of the Reverend T. Parker of Astle Hall in Cheshire. And at the August meeting of the volunteers at the White Cloth Hall, his men marched out where, in honour of his marriage, he entertained them with a very elegant collation in a tent erected specially for the event. After this, they performed their usual manoeuvres, and then Captain Dixon, Lady Dixon, and the Leeds Armed Association went to the Leeds Theatre to see a play called The Suspicious Husband. Not exactly the best play on the day he got married, and also a farce called The Romp. Shortly afterwards, it was disbanded. Unfortunately, peace was short-lived, and in 1794-3, war broke out with France again. Leeds volunteers once more had to be enrolled, but this time Thomas Lloyd, the gentleman here on the right-hand side, he was appointed the captain, and his painting, which was absolutely superb by Russell, actually shows him here in front of his men on Chapel Allerton Moor, and it's remarkable that this sword still survives today in the Lloyd family archive. Now, the end of the Napoleonic War in 1815 with success at Waterloo, and the enclosure of the moors, commons and waste of Chapel Allerton in the same year put an end to the moor for any activities like this. And it was here that the merchant elite ceased to be the dominant people in the area, and there was a new influx of wealthy people, a new class of people. These were the bankers, lawyers, medics, and industrialists who now sought to acquire large tracts of Chapel Allerton. Now, the population in 1801 was still only 1,054 souls, and so much of the area was still countryside. And as you can see here we've got Meanwood Hall, where the Beckets, as we shall see in a minute, moved. Here we've got the church that their sister built in honour of Christopher Becket. And here's the home of the Meanwood side family of Oates, today known as Meanwood Park. Let's look at the Becket family. In 1804, John Becket, banker of Leeds, rented Meanwood Hall and lived here for a decade before leasing Gledhow Hall from his friend John Dixon. Becket's second son, Christopher, joined the family business of Messrs. Becket & Co. and in 1824 bought the Meanwood Hall estate from Robert Denison, and that included this 18th century mansion. Christopher thought that it needed extending, and so he employed John Clark, this Scottish architect, to put this new frontage on. And this, from this fashionable mansion perched on the hilltop, he could look out onto his domain, which he came to regard with paternalism of a latter-day squire. Now, he was an ardent Tory, active in Leeds politics, twice mayor of Leeds, but he was a bachelor. And when he died, his sisters in 1847 built this church in his name. Now, the Beckets weren't alone in identifying Meanwood as a pleasant place to live. Fabulous watercolour by Walter Braithwaite, which is kept in the strong room of the Leeds Local and Family History Library, shows you the mansion on the hill, the church, and also as well the area which was purchased by a man called Mr. Edward Oates. The Worley family had lived since the 16th century in this area. We saw their magnificent 17th century stone house earlier. But when Francis Worley died in 1784, he had failed to provide an heir, and the estate went to his grandniece, Anne Rinder, and it remained in their family for 50 years. But they were absentee landlords, and they let the fabric fall into disrepair. However, this gentleman, Edward Oates, a successful solicitor based at Furnivall Inn, bought the estate as he had inherited property on the Headingley side of the beck from his father, who lived at Meanwood Hall. This now left him with 19 acres in Headingley and 35 in Meanwood. He refurbished the old Worley residence, but it was unimpressive for a successful lawyer. And on the 17th of October, he married Susan, daughter and heiress of Edward Grace, a wealthy cloth merchant. And so for his new bride, he built Meanwood side. And over the next 30 years, he built pools, he built dams, he built weirs, he beautified the area so that we enjoy his work even today. It is stunning. What a shame that the house was demolished. That's where you park your car today, so it gives you some idea. The cafe is behind you. Now that's Meanwood, but there was great change taking place in Gledhow. William Williams Brown, originally a junior partner with the Nicholsons, one of the wealthiest bankers of Leeds, he bought the old Oates residence of Allerton Hall. Thomas Benyon, who was a flax spinner, had bought Gledhow Hall. The surgeon William Hay III had bought land on which to build Gledhow Wood. And William Smith, a merchant, much to the annoyance, I should imagine, of William Williams Brown, built a new place called Allerton Hall. How utterly confusing. Here it is today. It's now the headquarters of Spire Healthcare. Gledhow had remained a haven for agricultural pursuits until Victoria ascended the throne. This was to change radically during her reign, and one of the first to identify the area as potential was William Smith, a phenomenally successful stuff merchant, who in 1841 employed the architect Samuel Sharp to design him this fine mansion. And during a holiday in Italy, Smith ordered pieces of sculpture for the interior of his new house, which still remain there today. And thank you very much, Spire Healthcare, for letting me go in there. How had he accumulated so much money? Well, he'd been born in the family home on Briggate, where his father was a member of the banking firm Perfect Smith & Co., but he decided there was more to be made as a cloth merchant, and indeed he did make a fortune. When he died on the 22nd of December, 1868, he was the oldest cloth merchant in Leeds, aged 84. There were also rich members of the medical fraternity attracted to the area, like William Hay III, grandson of William Hay, the most noted Leeds surgeon of the 18th century, who looked after Lady Dixon of Gledhow Hall during her numerous pregnancies. Clearly, the family had become close, and so were quite willing to sell land very near the hall for William, the grandson of William Hay, to build. When the British Medical Association held its 37th annual meeting in Leeds, it was Hay who was president of the surgical section, and of course, like his grandfather, dominated Leeds General Infirmary. He died on the 10th of May 1875, aged 79, included in the auction an Elizabethan bedstead from the Abbey House what is today the Abbey House Museum in Kirkstall, featuring elaborate carved and inlaid work. In addition was expensive furniture, paintings, books, carpets, and curtains. In addition, there were fine wines, vintage ports, oh, wonderful, and old East India Madeiras. But what about Moortown? Well, even more remarkable here. In Moortown, Edwin Simpson, a prosperous wool merchant, he bought 618 acres. And he seized the chance to build this fine house called Holly Bank. Later it was known as Donisthorpe Hall, as his new residence. And within this sale particulars of Messrs. Hepper and So is the future of Chapel Allerton encapsulated. Hollybank Estate contains an area of 618 acres in the midst of the Bramham Moor Hunt. And whether occupied in its present form or divided into a number of smaller properties, it possesses residential advantages of an extraordinary character, very suitable for building operations. It is situated at an altitude of 340 to 420 feet above the River Aire at Leeds, and note this, is far removed from the smoke of the town, and has not within the range of its principal views a single mill or manufactory of any kind. It's got excellent spring water, it's got town gas, and is believed to contain a valuable bed of gypsum wood stone. But this is the important line. It is close also to the line of the omnibuses running between Leeds and Moortown. Now, that's 1870. Look what it's described of in 1880. One of the pleasantest roads out of Leeds. You step in a tram car on Briggate and in half an hour, transported into a high-lying district where the air is pure and bracing, the scenery picturesque, the road lined with villas and tasteful gardens, where the outlooks of the undulating country are not only extensive but beautiful. Here are great trees, lovely gardens, mansions surrounded by parks, woody glens, clear purling streams, and all the charms of the country within sight of the busy town left behind. No better idea of wealth of Leeds is afforded than in the suburban mansions that stud the pleasant slopes of Meanwood, Chapeltown, Gledhow, and other places in the vicinity. You alight at Chapeltown, walk forward to the top of the hill at Moortown, 550 feet above sea level, and you enjoy the extended prospects to north, east, and west. Leeds Mercury, 1880. Now, shall we do just that? Shall we go and see what someone would have looked at in 1880? Well, how lucky are we? Because in the Thorsby Society collection, a gentleman called Edward Lancaster, the organist of St Mary's Church in Hunslet, did that exact thing. He got on that tram, he got off and walked to Moortown, and he painted that. And I think, above anything else, for you to think that in that period, that is what it looked like. More moorland, more town. And when you'd finished and you'd painted and you wanted something nice to eat and drink, you would go to this rural inn, the Chained Bull, better known to you as part of the car park at Marks and Spencer's near Moortown Corner. In 1901, the population remained only 5,841. Incredible, absolutely incredible. But this in the next century was to change, so that all these beautiful green verdant fields and area of moorland would be transformed by a sea of semi due to excellent public transport. It's just Queen's Arms here, Gledhow Valley Road at the bottom. Well, there we go. So the minute, an hour. I just want to acknowledge the fantastic support of Leeds Civic Trust, particularly you, Mark, there. You've had all the pressure this afternoon, but also the rest of the Civic Trust team. Rachel, who's editing it, Brian Oates, who gave me fantastic access to his family archive, the Thorsby Society, and, you know, a remarkable staff at Leeds Museums, Leeds Local History Library, West Yorkshire Archive, and the Leeds Library on Commercial Street. Could have done this without the help of all those people. But obviously what I'm very keen to do is get this book, The Illustrated of Chapel Allerton, into print. The thing is with it, I don't want it to be a cheap publication, and it will be very much like the book I produced with Kevin on Hunslet, same graphic designer, fully throughout in colour, but it's going to cost a lot of money. Now, there will only ever be 500 copies of the book ever printed. So in that sense, you are purchasing a piece of history. It's 350-page hardback, illustrated with fabulous landscapes, portraits, photographs, maps and plans. You've only seen a tiny proportion of those this afternoon. But the reality is we need 400 people to want that book before the printer can be paid. Now, I think it's important to stress that this is not for profit publication. It's a true labour of love. Rachel and I will not make a single penny out of this. So, next steps. Leeds Civic Trust will be in touch with you to see if you are interested in being a subscriber. We don't need any money at all until the book is printed in November, ready for delivery in December, making it the perfect Christmas gift. Now, if you're interested in the meantime in sponsoring the work that we're undertaking, there is already a button to press on the Leeds Civic Trust website for donations. But once again, thank you to all of you for actually tuning in this afternoon when the weather, for once, is extremely fine. Any questions?
Yes, we've had a general comment from David Lum rather than a question. Mr. and Mrs. Kitchinghams were apparently resident of Allerton Hall around the end of the 1700s. Two memorial stones in Chapel Allerton Cemetery state they died aged 99 and 100. We've had plenty of thank yous, and some person, an anonymous attendee, asked if the book covers the Potter Newton area. And I think that is, oh yes, and will this presentation be shared? Will it, because it's going to go on YouTube?
In answer to the Potter Newton, without going into technical details, we're sticking to Chapel Allerton. However, the bounds were extremely fluid between both Chapel Allerton and Potter Newton right up until nearly the end of the 18th century. Because the population was so small, who cared? Same on the old Woodley bounds, who cared? But when Jeremiah Dixon bought it, he's a cloth merchant. He does care. He wants to know absolutely to the square yard what he owns, and he ends up in terrible, terrible, terrible trouble with the Earls of Mexborough and the Lane Fox family of Bramham Park over those bounds, and in essence loses both cases. So say the Three Hullets, the Bowling Green Inn, that technically is in Potter Newton, and it doesn't get included in the book, but I don't include the rest of Potter Newton.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve. And of course, we look forward to the second part, which is by Rachel on the 30th of March.
Indeed. Thank you all so very much for attending this afternoon.
Okay, thanks and goodbye.